Welcome to the American Theatre Wing seminars on working in the theatre. These seminars are coming to you from CUNY, the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, which is right in the heart of Times Square, 42nd Street. The seminars are an outgrowth of the Wing School, and they are unique in being able to present to you the talent and the knowledge and the expertise of experts in the theatre in each field of theatre. I think that I'd like to go back a little bit for those that have been here before in the seminars. You'll have to bear with me. For those that haven't, I just like to say it. I'm very proud of the Wing. I'm proud of the kind of people that it brings, and I'm proud of the year-round program that the Wing has. We say theater in every form. We're the oldest organization that has been able to give to the community through the theater much-needed services. We send live, professional, Broadway and off-Broadway theater to hospitals and to schools. We also send and sponsor a program called the Saturday Theater for Children, in which live professional theater is brought to children at the earliest possible age in their own neighborhoods, in their own schools. The important thing about this program is that children make a commitment to buy a ticket. They learn to appreciate the theater as a need to go to it at all times, not just for an anniversary or a birthday. We think this is the best way to develop audiences for the future. These seminars that we bring to you is also a part of sharing. The sharing of knowledge that started with the Wing School, when all the professionals in the theater gave their services and contributed their knowledge to returning veterans so that they could rehone their skills. I'm indeed proud to right now introduce Jean Dalrymple, who is a member of the board, and Henry Hughes, also a member of our board, who will act as co-moderators on this, perhaps the most important seminar of all of our series. It is the Word. It is a seminar on playwrights, and so we can quickly get to all of them. Henry and Jean will do the introductions. Thank you very much for coming.
On my far right is James Kirkwood, who wrote a very successful musical, or co-wrote it, A Chorus Line. On his right, on his left is Howard Ashman, who wrote this, a musical called Little Shop of Horrors, which was done off-Broadway and is now transferred to off-Broadway, and I suppose eventually will transfer to Broadway and then be made into a film and so on. You know, it's come so that the Cinderella story is somehow more important than the substance of what is done. If you can be part of it, if you can make your play or your musical have this Cinderella story, then this musical itself really doesn't matter.
Like My Fair Lady.
And Arthur Kopit, who went from some years ago, established a new record for length of title with a play called Oh Dad, Poor Dad, Mama's Hung You in the Closet, and I'm Feeling So Sad, and is now the shortest, has now written the shortest title on Broadway, 9, so, which I guess is I guess shorter than even than 8.5, isn't it? Jean will introduce people on her left.
At my left is Peter Stone, who won the 1981 Tony for the best musical book, Woman of the Year, and he also won a Tony for one of my favorite musicals, a wonderful musical, 1776. And next to him is Maury Yeston, who is one of the authors of 9, and a wonderful book that is. By the way, I saw the film, and I thought, I saw the film after I'd never seen it before. And I thought it must be easier to adapt a film into a musical than a book or a play, because the scenes are sort of laid out for you. Is that true?
Well, I don't know. I didn't write the book. Arthur wrote the book.
Oh,
I wrote the music and the lyrics.
Oh, really? Well, you're not supposed to be here then.
Well, I'll leave.
Can we stretch it so that we include lyrics as the word?
Yes, that's good.
Because you're a lyricist, you can be here, but not because you're a composer.
I'll
No
sing.
humming. No
Yeah.
humming.
No, I'm terribly sorry. And next to him is a wonderful representative for authors, Mitch Douglas. And I think he'll tell us something about the problems of getting a musical on the boards today, mostly because of the cost.
So today, really, what we're going to try to do is to discuss the two problems that interest all of you, which is, first of all, how do you write a musical? How do you write a musical? That is the libretto or the book for it, and then secondly, having written it, how on earth do you get it produced? And the saga of Nine, I think, is perhaps the most recent Cinderella story. And I think maybe we would perhaps begin with Maury Yeston and Arthur Kopit telling us a little bit about the odyssey of Nine, and insofar as it can help those of you who have a musical as good as Nine in your bureau drawer. Maury, you were with it from the beginning. Arthur came in when the show was coming to Broadway, and I wonder if perhaps you could tell us briefly what how you went from taking this work out of your bureau drawer and into some kind of production.
I'd be happy to, as long as we can include another distinguished member of the panel, because, see, Howard Ashman was the first director of Nine at the Eugene O'Neill workshops, and made some extraordinary contributions to its dramatic structure in the summer of 1978, in a period of 3 weeks. So there, you may hear a more fascinating story than you bargained for.
Right.
I conceived of the idea of turning 8½ into a musical long ago, in 1973. Thought it had a marvelously original character in Guido, and a wonderful situation. And I thought that it could give rise to a very new, exciting kind of musical theater that would be as much a character study as a narrative. It was kind of a new idea. Being alone, I was thrown back upon my own resources as a composer and as a lyricist, and I immediately began writing songs. Wrote a number of songs which were showcased by BMI's musical theater showcase under the aegis of Lehman Engel.
The late Lehman Engel.
The late Lehman Engel, yes, indeed. And it attracted some attention, and the project began to develop from there. In 1978, the project was awarded the Eugene O'Neill Musical Theater Workshop Prize, and we were able to bring it up to the O'Neill with a group of actors and actresses, and Howard Ashman was the director, and wonderful job he did. To this scenario and this group of songs, he brought a number of interesting questions, and virtually every question that Howard asked became a song as a response. For example, I don't know how many of you have seen the show, but there's a woman in the show who's married to a man who's philandering and who leaves him in the second act. Howard's first question to me was, why has she stayed with him all these years in the first place? And in formulating a response to Howard, I formulated a woman who tells herself and fools herself into thinking that her husband makes movies, and this is really sort of he's exploiting his fantasies in his life, in his real life, to make his movies. It gave rise to My Husband Makes Movies. There was another moment when I was up against the wall with Saragina, the beautiful whore on the beach, or beautiful and horrible at the same time. And I remember saying to you, Howard, it was years ago, I said, I can't do this one. Nino Rota did it. I'm not going to go up against Nino Rota's music. Da da da, Dee-dee-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I remember it well. And that wonderful dance on the beach, and Howard said, you have to. You're...
You promised you wouldn't sing.
So he said, you're obligated to find a music theatrical equivalent for this. And he said, look, little boys, don't love like French people, don't love like German people, Italian love. And you walked out of the apartment, and about half hour later, I wrote, oh, be Italian. So gifted people who direct and who write books very often give composers and lyricists their best ideas. And then it was with...
Can you just say
yeah.
very quickly, so that
Sure.
people are here, to get accepted by the Lehman Engel workshop, the BMI workshop, did you just apply out of the blue, or did you know somebody who suggested it?
I applied out of the blue. I heard about it, and I went and I played 2 theater songs in 1970. And Lehman very kindly accepted me. And I should mention that with Lehman's passing, the workshop has been taken over by me and Ed Kleban, Alan Menken, Howard is helping, and Skip Kennan, and we just took in a new group of people, and we're hoping
And
to
what
teach
happens in that workshop? Does that, and briefly, I mean, what happens?
In the first year of the workshop, a series of assignments are given, standardized assignments. A number of straight plays are taken, and composers and lyricists are joined together, and they're asked to form teams, and they're asked to solve specific problems. For example, write a ballad for this moment in bus stop, or in that moment in
Did they team you with someone?
No, Lehman suggested that I write my own lyrics after hearing my work. And in the second year...
And the book?
Interestingly enough, the Librettist workshop is a separate group that Lehman taught and that he started later on. Originally, it was just...
It was just the composer and
composers and lyricists, yeah.
And then you applied to the O'Neill out of the blue, or did somebody... I mean, why did... After, did you get it? You didn't get it. Did you get a production at the BMI workshop? Or
No,
just
you
a
don't
reading?
get a production at all. What happens is that in the second and third year, students begin to develop their own properties and their own projects, and BMI very kindly puts on a showcase at the Edison Theater every year of 2 or 3 songs from what they deem to be worthy projects that have been written in the workshop that year. And that consequently attracts the attention of interested book writers and playwrights generally, producers, people in the business, and it's a way of exposing new talent.
And did that have anything to do with it going to the O'Neill, or did you?
In the long run, yes. 2 producers expressed an interest in their property, and they put me together with somebody who worked on it long before Arthur came in, or even Howard. It was Mario Frati, and
yeah.
he wrote a scenario. And it was that project that was sent to the O'Neill. The O'Neill advertised that they were looking for scripts and scores of new musicals.
And did the O'Neill wed you with Howard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then perhaps Howard can say something about the way it worked at the O'Neill. I mean, in other words, how the process of working on a musical like this on the O'Neill went, and specifically with this show.
That process is wonderful because it's very condensed. That happens in, I think, 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah. And really, I was confronted with 275 pages of libretto and about 13 songs, and we weren't allowed to do, the ring cycle. So I'm not. In fact, I'm not sure Mario is speaking to me yet, because I did substantial cutting. I think I really worked almost more as an editor than anything else up there. I got it down to something that was workable so that you could hear the songs. And there are other points involved in that. I think it's a wonderful kind of workshop thing. It's not as developed yet as a process as the
And then
Playwrights
did the doing of it at the O'Neill have anything to do with it getting a Broadway production?
Well, it became known in certain circles, put it that way, but it was still an enormously problematic piece, and it really wasn't until Arthur came and created a book that Tommy Toon began to see a way of putting the piece on.
Now, Arthur, how did he grab you?
I was called by my agent at ICM, and who asked me, if I would be interested in working on a musical based on Fellini's 8½, that Tommy Tune was interested in. And I had never written a book for a musical, but I had always wanted to. I'd thought there was enormous dramatic potential in the musical form, a belief that I was not dissuaded in by any means in the subsequent work. And at that, in fact, particular time, had been coming up with an original idea for a musical. It was sort of in the air. I was very excited, and I remembered the film. I went and I met with Tommy, whom I had never met, and Maury, and the producer, Michael Stewart. And there was already a book. I was brought into it. It's interesting why Tune is the person who thought of me. And it was on the basis of my play Wings, an unlikely basis for a musical. But my play Wings dealt with a woman who had a stroke, and very grim on one level. But structurally and conceptually, the play tried to show you what was happening both inside of her mind and outside of her mind, more or less simultaneously, and in such a way that the audience was not told whether you were in her mind or outside of her mind, but that you followed her own mental processes. And Tune felt that what was needed for 9 was a similar process. The central character, called in the show Guido Contini, has problems with reality, has problems with fiction. He has problems. He has problems with his wife. He has creative problems, and particularly, and the excitement, I think, of using Fellini's 8½, as a starting point for the musical was to try to find a dramatic way in which you could see what was happening in his real life, in his imaginary life, in his creative life, and blend these things sort of contrapuntally. So Tune felt that I had somehow worked out techniques that were useful for this particular show. So I came and I met with them. There was already a book which Tune told me didn't work for various reasons. He didn't need to go into it, but he really wanted a fresh start, and said that I should do whatever I wanted and simply not read the existing book, go off on my own and listen to the score. And I listened to the score, and I fell in love with it. And I had already thought that 8½, was a good idea for a musical, and thought that the area was right. So then Maury and I began to meet. Tommy Tune just said, I want to see what your response is to this material. You come up with something. I don't really, at the moment, know how to do it. It's not working. So I came in with a structure already existing. I had 2 structures. I had the film, the scenario, to go on. I immediately went and saw it again. Saw it a couple of times. Took some notes on scenes that seemed dramatizable or the kernel of the show, and obviously it had to be stripped down, and you had to find a focus, and you had to do what I think you do in any play. You had to find a line through, and but in a musical form you had to move faster, and you had to be clearer up front. You couldn't delay the revelation of the character because it's about the music and the lyrics, and there were certain structural demands that seemed obvious in this. And I spent a lot of time talking to Maury about structure. He had spent more time thinking about the music. And so we met several times, and he played the score, and I would try to work out a flow pattern, really. The main thing that happened, I remember talking with Peter. We were on a panel recently, and I looked back on this and tried to find out why did the whole thing work. And I think finally it worked because of something that might seem very simple, but I gather is not that simple. Every one of us ultimately was working on the same show. When I went to, and I heard Maury's score, and there was a time when I went to Tune, and I said, look, maybe there are some songs that may go, or there's some songs that may be added, but in my conception, there are certain songs here that are absolute pivot pieces, and if any of these songs go, then I don't know what the show is about anymore. Maury had already written those songs. And they had to do with Guido's character, with Louise's character, with a song, 9, about when the boy dealing with the past, with Saragina's song. There was a structure, and what I saw this as, for those of you who ski, you'll understand this. It was like a slalom course, and there were certain gates that had already been set up, and those gates couldn't be moved. Well, they could be moved this way or that, but they had to be there. And my task was to set out more gates to get us through this course without killing ourselves.
Did they have to be in the same order? Or?
No, they could be moved around to some degree, but there was a structure. There was what I thought was the most important song, and it was the climax of the show, and it's Guido sings, "I Can't Make This Movie." And then I teach playwriting at City College, and there seems to me, after all these years of thinking about theater, that there is a basic archetypal structure that all plays go through, and that my task was to try to impose this form upon it, as I said to Toon once, to kind of be a custom tailor. To write a book of a musical, I'm interested to hear how other writers think. You have to be somewhat humble. The big moments are going to be taken over by the music and the lyrics. And you also have to do something, particularly with 9, just you have to try to avoid what I gather is called the bump. In real life, people don't suddenly sing. If I started to sing here, you would cart me off. In a musical, they will suddenly sing. And what you've got to do is make the audience not conscious of the fact that, hey, these guys are suddenly singing, because then you're aware that they're not singing. And so the great trick, at least for me in 9, was to try to create scenes or a structure out of which the song would emerge so naturally and so organically and so necessarily that when they began to sing, you weren't aware of the fact, oh, here comes a song. And also to make sure that the songs didn't always come at the ends of scenes, so that you were bleeding together, music and book, so that the whole fabric would fit together in this kind of seamless whole. So
but you sort of gave yourself an excuse because it is operatic in a way, in form, so that that the audience accepts this artificiality.
But you've got to set up the terms right at the beginning. It's a game, and you've got to establish your rules. You've got to give them permission to laugh. You've got to give them permission to sing. They have to know it's a musical. And a lot of time is spent in the first 5 minutes, which to me in any play is the most crucial. It's the very beginning, and that's your framework. So I set out a structure. I talked to Toon about it, and he couldn't deal with the structure of the show at all. He just said, go and write it, because he couldn't deal conceptually on a verbal level. So I wrote a show then, and Maury wrote some more music and took some songs out, put some other songs in, and it was a very exciting relationship, because unlike a straight book, I was talking to somebody else. It wasn't all me. And then we saw it, and then a very interesting thing happened in the further development of the show. I wrote it with men and women. The principals were women. The songs were sung by Guido or by women, but I had men and women in the show. And everybody liked the book, and it worked, and I liked it, and Maury liked it, and Toon liked it, and we started casting the show. And we saw all of these very exciting women coming in to audition, and those were the principal parts. But the men that we were auditioning for the other parts just weren't as exciting. And Toon said, my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just have all of these women? They're so gifted and talented. And all of us, our energy just dropped as soon as we saw the men that we were going to have for these other parts. And they weren't the major singing roles.
Anita Morris's role, I wouldn't.
Well, Anita, you see, the major parts, the producer, Lillian's part, was a man. But initially, Lillian didn't have a song either. So the songs were always by women and Guido, except when, or the little boy, except in St. Sebastian, when you had a male and female chorus. So Toon then said, I have this idea, and he analyzed something very, very brilliantly, I thought, which is the task that a playwright often has of presenting a person on stage. He can be a writer, he can be a painter, but he's a genius. And we have to make the audience believe that he's a genius, and we can't show you his work. And we've got to create, and what comes with genius is power, and the people being awed by him. And Toon said, if I have Guido on stage at the beginning, surrounded by women, and they are all in awe of him, in love with him, or hating him, but he is the focus of their energy, that gives him such power that immediately we will give him the credibility of a genius, of significance. And he was absolutely right. That was wonderful. And he said he wanted to have all women and Guido, and he wanted to use as the analog the conductor, because he saw that the play was about a man unable to conduct his life. And it was theatrical. I had great problems with it. So did Maury. Maury, I think, had problems with the sound, primarily. What would happen if he had no male voices? I had problems with with credibility. Would I believe this was a real spa? Would I believe it down through the show if I just didn't see any men coming on? We had a lot of very strong discussions, and it was very close to Maury and me withdrawing from it, because Toon was trying to explain what he wanted. I was trying to understand what he wanted, and I couldn't figure out what he wanted because he was using images that were set in this country, in this day, and I was trying to say, let's keep it to a show that's Italian and set slightly in the past. We were getting nowhere. We had a dinner, and my agent, Luis Sanjurjo, was there as a kind of peacemaker to this whole thing. And I had learned something, I guess, from watching The
You
Hustler.
have to get to agents afterwards.
Did you?
Hold the agents.
Well, he was very well. It all deals. It's very hard to eliminate.
Had you signed your contract yet?
Oh, I'd signed a contract, but it doesn't. We were in the workshop. But what happened was, at that point, I told Toon what I thought the show was about, which didn't seem to be what he thought it was about. And he said, "That's exactly what I want it to be about."
Well, it was much more dramatic than that. I remember the lunch break. I arrived having had about 8 wine spritzers.
We knew it was the end. This was the end of the whole collaboration.
And I kept on drinking wine spritzers, and somehow there didn't seem to be a meeting, and Toon he seemed very confused, and Arthur seemed very confused because it seemed that they were talking about the same thing, and finally Tommy said, well, gee, I don't know what to do, and Arthur said, well, look, when I got involved in this project, here's what I thought I was getting involved with, and he delivered a 5-minute oration on the nature of the piece that he wanted to write, that he felt he had written. And when he got done, there wasn't a dry eye or a seat in the house. And Toon said, well, that's exactly the show that I want to do. And then we were off.
And so I said, in that case, you have the women, and we'll do it as a workshop, because as long as we have an organizing principle, we can say, is this scene, whether it's with women or chimpanzees or whatever, is this scene about what the show is about, then I know what we're dealing with. And so we went into the workshop structure to develop it, and the actors never saw the script, and we went moment to moment, writing a new script each day as we went along, based on the structure. The structure that I had come up with Maury remained the same, and obviously to a great extent from Howard.
That's right.
The whole thing comes together, but it was an amazing process with the actors, creating a show on the spot, and we didn't know from each day what was going to happen. And I had a typewriter in the dressing room with the telephones, and was with a Xerox machine.
What was the central?
It was amazing.
What was the central essence of that you insisted upon holding to, as long as
the story, the conflict, that it was about a man, and it wasn't about what Toon kept saying. It's about modern women. And I said, I don't know what modern women means. If you want these characters to be fuller or richer, I know how to do that. And if we know that it's about this man, and it's not about an artist. If I can care, I have to care about Guido. I have to feel that this man could die, that he loves a wife, that the wife is with him because she believes that he is the man for her, that he has, in fact, real, down-to-earth problems. At some level, it has to make sense to me as a show in which somebody's life is on the line.
and at the end, I think a lot of people feel that the happy end, so-called happy ending, in which there's a reunion with his wife, is in a certain sense nominal. That there is not that this is not the traditional, oh, I'm sorry that I was so difficult with you, and not from now on it'll be better.
I don't think there's any reason to believe that things are going to be fine between Guido and Louisa. All that's happened is that Guido has grown. Guido has suffered. Guido has felt remorse. Guido has recognized things about himself. Guido has tried to choose. I think the implication is that Guido will solve to a great extent his artistic problems, because they're linked with his social and psychological and emotional problems. And what Louisa has said is, I'm going to give you another chance. And he says, I need you. And it doesn't mean at all that he's going to give up womanizing. But there's a very important line somewhere, and he says, I have to use my life. Toward the end of the show, he says, I must use my life. She says, fine, use it, but use it well. It really has to do with the way in which Guido has been dealing with other people. So it isn't a happy ending, but Louisa ought to give him another chance, given the fact that he has suffered.
Is there anything in what Arthur and Maury have been saying, and Howard, that rings a bell with Jimmy or Peter?
Not a word, no.
I want to hear about that.
I enjoyed that. I hope they both live as long as their anecdote.
I would have been briefer, but I know what happens when you have Peter on the panel.
You know why we're all talking like this? Because we know what business we're in.
That's
It's
true.
a tough, mean, backbreaking.
I had intended to be more contentious today. Probably
I spent the entire night flying back from California, which would make Mother Teresa contentious.
Right. Why don't you take a nap then?
That's the whole... I just did.
When they called me up and asked me to be on this panel, and they said, and Peter Stone's, I said, well, could you call him up and ask him not to talk so much and not to be so funny? Because he's a very funny man.
Clearly they did.
And they said no. So I called him up and I said, I'm not going to go on the panel if you talk a lot and if you're as funny as you used to be. So those are the ground rules. But he's going to break them.
No, go.
You're
go
going to be
ahead.
the first one to break it.
No.
No.
After
I
you.
Listen, I want to say a word.
See what happens when you're polite?
For the record, Maury, I want you to know that I'm perfectly aware that you are responsible for the wonderful score and lyrics for Nine, which I greatly admire.
Especially
But since
for the
this
record.
is a playwrights seminar, I thought you were also one of the authors as I introduced you. And having said that, I bow.
Gene, there was something that made me curious, and I wondered why, and this may be a rude question to ask, but I'm curious, why Howard's Association didn't continue with the project, or is that something we shouldn't get into?
No,
that's interesting.
Directing it?
Yeah.
Well, because the O'Neill was only for 2 weeks, and then one had to go find a producer.
Right.
I couldn't find a producer. And it was only years later when somebody expressed interest in it. It was the Richard Rogers Foundation that had selected it.
But to be quite honest,
Yeah.
that was somewhat mutual because,
Yeah.
and it's very interesting to me. I hadn't heard you say it before, that you all had confronted the problem of how do we know that Guido's a genius. I had decided up there that that was quite impossible to do. I had decided up there that the basic facts that we had about him were that he deals with the world in an incredibly inhumane way, and that he deals with women in a way that almost belies the depth we're supposed to attribute to his films and to his work. And I butted my head up against that time and time again, and never really could solve it. I'm
And
excited
Howard
to
said,
hear that
don't
you
bring this to New
confronted that one.
York.
That's
He said, in this present
where the women
form,
came
don't
from.
bring this to New York. And
Yeah.
Peter, walking down the street one day, said, project will never work because what Fellini has in 8.5 is it's about himself, it's about Fellini.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why do I get the feeling I'm in the presence of the birth of 10?
Don't let him off the hook.
But I think you brought up a very good point, which is that, and this is something that maybe Peter and Jimmy can address themselves to. In the theater, you do create collaboration. You do have collaborations, and there is a certain sense of loyalty that is implied in these collaborations when they are happy ones, and yet to get a musical produced, you really have to be willing to go with whatever is accessible. In other words, if a producer comes along and makes it possible, but only if you have so-and-so in it, and it's directed by so-and-so, and if you bring in so-and-so to do work on the book. And the question is, how much are you betraying the people who have put the time in already, or is your first loyalty to get the work done?
To start right in being contentious, I think that doesn't really happen often enough to be worth talking about. I think that it doesn't come up very often. I feel somewhat the senior member because I've had, I think, now 8 or 9.
But you've been brought in to fix other people's books? You've been brought in to fix other people's books?
Not in any sense that would be relevant to this discussion. I've come out of town, I've gone out of town at the request of authors, never without the request of the author himself. But we can talk, I don't think there's time to talk about the Dramatist Guild today, which I'm the president, in which we're undergoing difficult times. And as Jim, who's a member of the council, and as Arthur is a member of the council, we're involved in complicated things. And producers right now want the right to replace writers and bring in other writers. And that's never happened without the permission of the writer himself. And I think that's very important, so that there's no conflict there. As far as betraying or loyalty, I think it doesn't come up all that often. I think what is important is the nature of the collaboration. Musical is a collaborative effort. And that is the single most important element to keep in mind when you're doing a musical. Everything that's been said here really is a problem of the collaboration. For instance, what Arthur spoke about, doing the same show. That is the basic job of the collaboration, is to do the same, to work on what Frank Lesser, who somehow knew everything there was to know about musicals and had the added ability to articulate it. Well, oftentimes musicians and choreographers are extremely creative, extremely inventive, but are not articulate with words. They're more abstract. They see things abstractly. It's one of the difficulties in the collaboration when you, for instance, have a choreographer, this was discussed too, as a director. Choreographers are by nature anti-word. Almost all of them. Words are not the way they express themselves. They express themselves symbolically. They express themselves abstractly in movement. And so words become the enemy. And I've worked with choreographer after choreographer, whether it was Fosse or Champion or Tune or any of them. Words make them nervous. It's not the way they like to express themselves. And Jerry Robbins, who in many ways I consider the greatest of the choreographer directors, was always sensible enough to bring in a director with him, or an assistant who was the book director. Incidentally, I hate the word libretto. I think it's, I had the pleasure of teaching a course at, am I allowed to say NYU here? And they have a very fine graduate program in musical theater. It's a new, it's a new program, and it's quite good. And I think also, since Bernice is here, that we've spoken so much about the BMI workshop, that ASCAP has also a very, very fine musical workshop that exists here. And I think between BMI, ASCAP, NYU, and what's going on here, I think, and what the theater wing contributes to, it's all extremely
thank you.
Right. I think it's extremely... now, if we can just get the theater wing to impose a little more control on the producers and get authors on stage during the Tony Awards.
I agree with you. I'm in full agreement.
We do not consider decoration, set decoration, costume decoration, or lighting as secondary art, but writers do feel somewhat chastened to find themselves in that company off stage, and they don't like it. And they have, in fact, withdrawn from the Tony process very positively and vociferously, and somewhat chagrined at not having heard from the producers about that. However, we still get our free Tony seats, and we use them.
Well, the American Theatre Wing had nothing to do with that.
We know that.
Isabel will tell you.
We know that. We do know that.
We won't take that up
But
now.
The letter was, yes.
Yeah.
However, to get
Immediately.
back to the music, the
Maybe
collaboration is everything. And I think that we're here discussing book. Libretto was what musicals used to be. Operas have librettos, and they're scenarios. And they're not plays. And so I don't like the word. A musical book is nice. A musical author is a nice nice phrase. I think librettist is somewhat confusing, and I think it might not be. Were the musical in its present state rather anti-book at the moment. You wouldn't think so in the presence of the people here, because there's a very good book on Chorus Line and Shop of Horrors and Nine. But they're very lonely things in the middle of such efforts as Dancing, which is an actual effort to do away with book, and Sophisticated Ladies and Ain't Misbehaved. And even Merrick made a very big point, even in 42nd Street, of saying that there were merely lead-ins and crossovers.
Was that Merrick's decision, or was
yes,
that the...
very much so. As I understand it, I could be wrong about it, but as I understood it, it was.
But couldn't the authors have insisted upon calling it a book and not crossovers and stuff?
They, I don't know. They received their contractual rights. I don't know that whether or
I
not.
heard that Michael, at one point, wanted that because he felt the book had been slightly butchered, and that he didn't want it to say book because he would be up
I know it was Merrick's
for more
decision of
reading
words.
it,
I didn't
because
know.
the book
yeah.
writer is usually the one that gets it.
What do you
And-
prefer?
That's
What do you
important to
prefer
discuss.
saying?
I think that's important to discuss why the book writer, and I think it has to do with why there are so few book writers actually operating at the moment, full-time people. They're really doing it now out of love of the form more than any great wave of advantage to the book writer. I think there are three basic reasons why playwrights are reluctant to do musical books. I think first, the collaborative process itself is foreign to many of them. As a novelist, a playwright works somewhat alone like a novelist, and he sits there and likes that privacy and likes that exclusivity. So I think if you don't like the collaborative process very much, now all writers in the theater have to get into it eventually, but it's very, it's a very, very complete collaboration in the musical. And so if they don't like that, then they shouldn't obviously write books. But then there are two more problems. And Arthur mentioned that what happens, the composer and lyricists take away your best moments. In fact, yes, they do. It's a musical. However, it's how that happens that is very much involved with the process of writing a musical. I've written them in all different kinds of ways. I've run into a score already written, and then you sit down and write a book around it. I've been there and written. A lot of composers say, write the book, and then we'll figure out where the songs go. This last time out, I worked a way that I'd not worked before and became so involved in it and felt it was so correct that I don't think I would work any other way. And that is, worked with the composer-lyricist from beginning to end, wrote a scene up to the song, and stopped. Then the song, discussed the song, they discuss the scene fully with you, you discuss the song fully with them, both create both in terms of outline, in terms of structure. So that song, it isn't a book that's either been stopped at that point and continues later where it left off. The song, if the song were pulled out, there would be a hole in the story, in the narrative, in the development of character. Secondly, you haven't written your scene and had it taken away from you, which is very destructive to writing. I know that the first show I ever did on Broadway was a show I wrote for Robbie Lance, who's now agent again. I think I made him a successful agent again. Which was a show with Alfred Drake called Keane, which was done some 20 years ago. And I wrote a book, and I was very happy with it. It was adapted from Sartre. There was a lot of substance, a lot of meat in there. And I would see the best scenes taken and musicalized. In one sense, one scene was taken without changing a word and was in a rather recitative manner, was simply musicalized. Quite correctly. Quite correctly. It was the perfect solution to a problem in the show, and it should have been. Except I saw that scene suddenly become one of their better songs. And it was difficult. And that difficulty is not, I'm not entirely right being injured by that, but you can't help yourself. So that's a problem. You must find a process of working where you are not giving your best scenes. Another thing happens if they take your best scenes, you're left with a book without good scenes. So you must, again, create with the composer and lyricist a situation where the high book scenes are allowed to stand and exist and where they go, because a show must have those as well. The third reason is much more crass, but very, very important. It's simply a matter of dollars. Somehow, back in the 30s and early 40s, before the book musical, Oklahoma and so forth, when the Rodgers and Hammerstein show, or whether it was Pal Joey, or whether it was whatever, when suddenly there was the book music, when suddenly they realized that the musicals were more than just a collection of songs with lead-ins and crossovers, there was an arrangement made where the score was counted as two parts of the collaboration financially. Music, lyrics, and book were three parts of the score. So the music and lyrics walked off with most of the money in the arrangement, and the book got its third. But the book, in fact, as the new musical evolved, became about 5/8 of the evening. If you take a show as 2 hours and 20 minutes, or without intermission, let's say 2 hours of show, there's about 50 minutes of music in most shows, and in most book shows. I'm not talking about things.
Peter, can I interrupt you right now? Because I don't want James Kirkwood to have the whole second half.
Oh, that's what I'm
seminar.
hoping for.
So, could you please start on chorus line just before we have to break, and then we'll come back to you.
I told him it was a bad idea.
I know.
A lot of people did.
See, what most people don't realize is that when I hear a show that sounds as good as 9 and as good as chorus line, I tell them it's a bad idea. Because what do I need that around for?
Well,
Please.
Okay.
All right.
A chorus line. I had always loved musicals. I had never really thought about writing one because somehow I thought there was a mystique to writing a musical that I wasn't in on and didn't know about. As I think there's a mystique to writing lyrics. I would never try to write a lyric, yet I bet if I tried, I might be able to. However, I hadn't thought about it, but I love musicals, and I had met Michael Bennett because I wrote a play called P.S. Your Cat is Dead, and he toyed around with directing it on and off and on and off, and finally directed Seesaw instead. And so I was not too pleased with Michael, and I didn't know him that well, and I went to the theater one night, and I saw his agent, Jack Lenny, and he said, "Oh, Jimmy," he said, "Michael's over there in the corner." And I said, "How is the little bastard?" "Oh, we can say it." "Well, that's a word you can say." And he said, "Fine." He said, "Go over and say hello to him." I said, "You say hello to him." And he said, "Oh, come on." So I went over and I tapped Michael on the shoulder. I said, "Hi, Michael." And he said, "Jimmy," he said, "I've been trying to get you for a couple of days." I said, "What for? You want to direct P.S. Your Cat is Dead again?" And he said, "No." He said, "I have an idea for a musical, and have you ever thought of writing a musical?" And I said, "Yeah, I've thought about it, but I don't know how. I wouldn't know how." And he said, "Well, if everybody knew how, everyone would be doing it, and there'd be all these hits." And so I thought about that, and he said, "Why don't you have lunch with me tomorrow, and I'll tell you what I think it's about, and see if you'd be interested." So he had been working already with Ed and with Marvin, and Nick Dante, who was one of the dancers in the original rap session, which Michael had to see if there was enough rich material about dancers to do a musical about.
He'd already done these tape recordings of the dancers.
Yes. And so I had lunch with Michael, and he said, "I want to do a show about chorus dancers and about the audition process." Well, that was it for me, because I had been a performer for years, and I had been in several musicals. And the idea of getting up and auditioning in a theater with those unknown, unseen faces out there in the dark, and the rudeness and the stage light and the people in the wings that all sounded better than you did.
Well, you thought
and
they did.
if I used to be so nervous that if I had had cymbals and I could have accompanied myself. And I used to think, thank God I'm not a woman, because I would have to wear high heels and I would fall off them. I would be so nervous. So when he said that, I signed on immediately. I said, "Yeah, I would love to do that." And then, because I know collaborations can be tricky, I said, "Who will I be working with?" He said, "Well, I was going to write it." Michael said he was going to write it with Nick Dante, but he felt he didn't have the discipline. And he's not a verbal person. I think Michael is not in that way. As talented as he is, and he certainly is. And I also don't think he has the patience to sit down and confront the page like that. So I said, "But I don't know Nick Dante." He said, "Well, you come up to the apartment and you meet each other." And I said, "But what if we don't get along, or what if we don't have the same feelings?" He said, "Well, just meet." So I went up to Michael's apartment, and I walked in, and there was this young man sitting on the sofa, and Michael said, "Nicholas Dante, this is James Kirkwood." And Nicholas got up and crossed the room, and he said, "You wrote one of my all-time favorite novels, Good Times, Bad Times." And I turned to Michael and I said, "There will be no problem with this collaboration whatsoever." And actually, there wasn't. The only thing we fought about was punctuation, because Nicholas had not been a writer that much before, and there were always dot, 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 dash, 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 and I couldn't read a page if he typed it up. But addressing myself to what Peter was talking about, I loved the idea of composer-lyricists coming in, and when they first said, "Listen, you know the song Goodbye 15, Goodbye 16, Hello Love," that whole adolescent section in chorus line, Marvin Hamlish said, we can't write a song about that. Why don't you and Nicholas write a little one-act playette, and we will raid it." And I had never heard that expression. I thought, raid it? What, with a hand grenade? What are you going to do to that? And he said, "No, we will take it, and then we will make it into a musical number." So we wrote a whole little one-act play about all of our adolescents. And they took that and made that into that rather long, large musical number, which I think is marvelous. And that's why so many of the lines don't rhyme. And people say, "Gee, those are funny lines. Tits, when am I going to grow tits? You know, your father was a bum. Mother always in the kitchen cooking." But it was because they did rate it, and they used some of that original
They couldn't make it rhyme?
Well, they didn't feel, they made some of it.
Is that a standard phrase in collaboration, rating?
Well, I think it is. I'd never heard it before.
That's a good reason why it's not.
But
I've heard it pronounced with a P. So.
lunch afterwards, Peter. But the collaboration actually was a very happy one. We all worked together. You know, we would write a scene, and Marvin and Ed would write a song, and then we would go on. And it was a terribly, terribly happy collaboration. However, I think the marvelous thing about doing that show was that we were able to do it in workshop. And we rehearsed for 3 months. We rehearsed so long that I remember finally I said to Michael, the performers are like racehorses now. They want to be let out of the paddock, and they don't know what they have. Because they were, for 3 months, there was Ed and Nick and Michael and Marvin and I sitting like this, that close to them. And they were going through this show endlessly. And they didn't know what was funny or what was touching or what worked or didn't. And I said, we must invite 20 or 30 or 40 people in so that they can get some fix on what they're doing, some idea of the acceptance of the material and the performances. And I shudder to think what would have happened with that show if we had had to go to Boston for 2 or 3 weeks and then move on to Philadelphia. Because the great thing about doing a musical in that manner is that you don't have to do cosmetic surgery because you know the curtain's going to go up at 8 o'clock and people have paid $20, $30, now $40, $50 a seat to see you try to patch your mistakes together. So we could do major surgery in a rehearsal hall on 19th Street and 7th Avenue. And when we would, I remember the first time we did a run-through of the show, without any stops or anything, it was 4 hours and 20 minutes long. Now we thought that might tax the playgoer just a tiny bit, especially in that we were hoping to have no intermission. And so we said after the show, the cast were ready for the oxygen tents, you know, and Kelly Bishop, I went up to Kelly and I said, well, and she said, well, honey, I think we have War and Peace as a musical. You know? So we all went back to Michael's apartment and we said, look, we have this big problem. We have twice the show that we need. So we could just say, well, we'll take that subplot out with Al and the fist fight between those two, and we could do major surgery. Whereas if we had been out of town, God only knows what would have happened.
Well, that happens out of town, too.
Yeah. Well, yes,
I mean, the show is always over long.
But you
I
don't
think
have
the out-of-town
luxury.
process. I think the out-of-town process is not a bad one. I think the workshop can oftentimes supplant it. But I think, as opposed to not going out of town, in other words, without a workshop, doing your work here in New York, I think is fatal. And I think that the workshop production is very, very important.
Oh, yeah.
Or out of town is very important.
There's much to be said for both of them.
I think the work is done out of town. I think most shows open out of town a good 40 minutes to an hour long.
Oh, sure.
George Coffin, who a stickler for such things, often said, you must be ruthless. Everyone says, well, let's not cut it yet because we want to see what works and what doesn't work. It's a very bad mistake. Rehearsal time is very limited, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And Coffin said, if your show is a third too long, you've wasted a third of your rehearsal time, rehearsing things that will never be in the show. So you've rehearsed the material that's going to cut out, so you've lost a third of your rehearsal time.
I wish that we had 4.5 hours for this seminar. I don't think any one of our audience would walk out on it.
Alex Cohn told
Unfortunately, there's never enough time for the seminars that the American Theater Wing brings to you from CUNY, the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We are perhaps best known for the Tony Award. And how many do you need? And named for Antoinette Perry, one of the founders of the wing. It stands for service, and it stands for the achievement of excellence in the theater, in the field of theater. I want to thank everyone in this panel. I constantly am thanking people, but the wealth of talent and the knowledge and the being able to be so articulate to pass on to you their knowledge makes me very humble indeed, but proud to be president of the American Theater Wing. I have to thank also our wonderful volunteers. The wing is made up of volunteers. We are a nonprofit organization, and we have a program that goes on all year round and Peggy Kahn, and Peter Mulholland, and Ida Ostro, and Luann Pavlin, and Mary Ballack, and Rochelle Housey, Florence Huggins, Phyllis Sokoloff, and Lynn Delaney are our volunteers that work at the office and help put these seminars together. I'm Isabel Stevenson, and I'm president of the wing, and I thank you all for coming, and I just hope that you'll come back again and again, and that you too will be a Broadway composer, playwright, or lyricist and sit on our panel at some point. Thank you very much. Thank you.